if we try to look 50 years ahead, there are some things we can predict fairly confidently. One is that the world will be more crowded. The population is likely to be around 9 million people. The other thing that will have changed is the balance between different parts of the world. The Earth's intellectual and physical capital is going to be more and more concentrated in Asia. We'll see the end of 4 centuries where Europe and the United States were the dominant powers. We'll also see a world where there is greater pressure on resources, because each of the people in the world is going to be more demanding in terms of food and energy. Already we are seeing the benefit of some new technologies, and particularly mobile phones, which have had an impact already in Africa, and they have had a wonderful effect in allowing more people to participate in the knowledge economy. But we have to bear in mind that we have to feed this much larger population and do this in a world where we are constrained by land area, water and other resources, and also in a world where climate change may aggravate many of these other problems. And these are going to be big issues for the world. If we are to surmount these problems, we certainly need new technology. We need to move away from the carbon-based economy to develop clean energy in various forms. And this is an opportunity. Indeed, it's an opportunity for whichever countries can take the lead. And I hope very much that in Europe we will indeed take the lead in developing these new technologies, not just for ourselves, but for the rest of the world. Incidentally, if we want to do this for ourselves, we need to work together much more in Europe. Because in my view, the most promising long-term energy future for Europe would be to depend on solar energy from sunny areas in Spain and maybe North Africa. And if we are to achieve that goal, we need a Europe-wide smart grid to transmit the energy. And that would be a major infrastructure project which needs European coordinated action, but no bigger actually than the construction of the railway system in the 19th century. But that's a challenge, and we ought to start thinking now about this, otherwise the United States will be ahead in that. So that's a real opportunity for Europe. And incidentally, to speak as a scientist, I note that Europe does very well indeed when we have to work together. I'm an academic scientist. I'm interested in particle physics and astronomy. And in Europe, we've got the world's best lab for particle physics at CERN. We now have the world's best telescopes run by the European Southern Observatory. And we have a space program which isn't on the scale of the American one, but is at least as cost effective. We've achieved that because we have to work together. But in many other areas of science and technology, we don't work together enough, and therefore we don't have as many peaks of excellence as other parts of the world, particularly the US. And so I think we should do all we can to ensure that we can cooperate across Europe. Otherwise, we'll have it harder to compete with the United States, and even more concerning, we'll be overtaken by the developing powers of Asia. One of the really severe issues is going to be to ensure that the benefits of globalization are widely and uniformly shared. At the moment, we are seeing billions of people being brought out of poverty in Asia and Latin America, but Africa is being left behind. And I think it's crucially important that Africa is enabled to make use of its natural resources, because if we have glaring inequalities, we will never have a peaceful world. One of my main concerns, actually, is that humans are not only changing the world collectively through our impact on the environment. Indeed, this is the first century when one species, namely ours, has an impact on the entire planet's future. But we are individually much more empowered by technology, and this means that we are more vulnerable to small disruptive groups than was ever the case in the past. And I think it's going to be a challenge to all governments to manage the tension between security, privacy and freedom in this changed world. But of course, the best remedy is to remove the senses of grievance, bitterness and injustice which are bound to continue so long as we have gross inequalities between the developed and developing world, and so long as the benefits of globalization are not fairly shared. So, if we look 50 years ahead, then we need to consider all these global problems. The big difficulty, of course, for politicians is that always the urgent trumps the important. It's easy to overlook long-term problems, however important they are, if they are longer than the electoral cycle, longer even than the normal timescale over which economists discount the future. So we need to think in a different perspective if we are to engage with these very long-term problems. And here, scientists can help. Scientists have two special roles, I think, in ensuring we have a bright future. One is, of course, that the scientists provide the basic ideas which are the basis of our technology, and that's crucial. But it should not be just the scientists who decide how science is applied. That should be a choice made by all citizens. And that's why it's important that all citizens, even though they won't all be scientists, have enough feel for science to be able to participate in debates about science, to decide what sort of ways we want to use to develop energy, how much we want to value the environment and biodiversity, how far we want to allow biotechnology to impact on the nature of human beings and animals, and to what extent we want to use GM crops and things like that. These should be matters publicly debated, but that'll only happen if the public has a feel for science, and also if scientists themselves are prepared to engage with the wider public and act as scientific citizens rather than just speaking to other fellow specialists. I personally would derive less satisfaction if I could only speak to fellow specialists about my work, and I think all scientists really need to engage with the wider public. Scientists have another special role, I think, which is that their work is intrinsically international. That's always been the case. We're speaking of the Royal Society in London, which back in the 1960s, when it was founded, was already international. It published in its journals papers from scientists all over Europe, and they all corresponded with each other. And there are many cases in our history where science has crossed national barriers. Humphrey Davy, the British scientist, travelled freely in France during the Napoleonic Wars. Benjamin Franklin, the American, told the American rebel ships that they should give free passage to Captain Cook on his expeditions. And, of course, in the depth of the Cold War, scientists in the Soviet Union and in Europe and the US maintained open channels of communication. So scientists are very international. And even now today, we see this in, for instance, the Middle East. There's a project called Sesame, which is a physics project based in Jordan, which gets around the same table scientists from Israel and from Iran. And that's a diplomatic triumph in its own right, and exemplifies how science can lead in developing an open world. And those are, therefore, areas in which science is very important. But science is not just for scientists. It's important that science is presented to the wide public so that the public can share in the applications of science. There are many things science could do which we may not want to do for ethical or prudential reasons, but those choices should be made by the wide public. And Europe, in particular, if it acts together, can not only be a beacon in terms of maintaining high levels of science and culture, but also, by working together, it can take a lead in clean energy and in developing these technologies which the rest of the world are going to use.